Hello, everybody.
Hello.
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 Today's episode of Next Slide, Please, which I hope you find as exciting as I do, is a very basic introduction to why viruses are super interesting and why we wouldn't exist without them. What do you know about viruses? Like, what are they?
Cold?
From
A cold?
A cold is is a virus.
Viruses are like not technically classed as like living things, unlike bacteria, because they don't themselves contain the capacity, like they don't do all the things that they don't themselves contain the capacity to reproduce on their own, I guess, and they don't do all the things that like living things can do, so they have to hijack the cells of another creature in order to reproduce, because they're like made up of RNA, right? And then they go inside the nucleus of another creature.
Or DNA contained within a protein capsid is their like basic form. Yeah.
Right.
Isn't
so it
RNA,
can be DNA
Isn't
as well.
RNA what saves you if you get caught at sea?
Royal National...
No, that's the RNLI, sorry.
So you're quite right. So there is this question of, are they even alive? And, you know, if we turn to Mrs. Nerg to answer that question.
Mrs. Nerg!
Yeah.
I know
Mrs.
her!
Nerg. Yeah, or Mrs. Gurn. Some people say Mrs. Gurn.
That's more
we're
fun,
talking
Mrs.
to Mrs.
Gurn.
Nerg today.
Right.
Yeah, if we ask Mrs. Nerg, do they have movement, respiration, sensation, nutrition, excretion, reproduction, and growth? I mean, in their virion form, which is that, you know, RNA or DNA with a protein capsid kind of floating around, no, they can't really move on their own. They can't do really any of that stuff on their own. If they're in but they do have essentially a two-part life cycle where they, you know, part of their life is not really in that form. It's embedded in another cell. And then, it becomes much more of a grey area. So
is it vegan to eat a virus?
I'm not particularly concerned about it.
I think you're a bad vegan if you eat a virus.
But vegans eat all kinds of living things. They're just plants and stuff.
Oh.
Yeah.
Forgot about plants.
Yeah.
I just assumed that vegans lived off photosynthesis.
They just don't eat.
So Mrs. Nerg, not enormously helpful. Let's try and figure out instead then where they fit into the tree of life, because they must be related somehow, right? RNA, DNA.
Are they? Or are they just completely their own thing? That would be wild. Sounds unlikely. I can't believe that would be the case.
So there are three basic hypotheses, and it is still hotly contested which one of these is correct, if any of them are correct, if a mixture of them are correct, because viruses can be quite, you know, they not all seem super closely related to each other. And there's no fossils to tell us whether...
Right.
Which one is true. So the three basic hypotheses are the virus first hypothesis. So the idea that actually viruses are where it all started. And bacteria, archaea, eukaryotes evolved from them.
But how would they reproduce if they don't have the cells? Chicken or the egg, how would they reproduce if they don't have the cells to do all the stuff for them? How does that work?
Well, there's the second hypothesis, which is the regression hypothesis, which is basically, you know, bacteria came first and then some of them lost, you know, a lot of the functions that bacteria have.
What's the difference between bacteria and viruses?
So a virus is basically just the DNA or RNA and a protein capsid. Some of them are slightly more complex than that, but they cannot do anything on their own. They cannot reproduce on their own. A bacteria, on the other hand, can reproduce on their own. They have all these, they have a cell.
Then why the hell does a cold make my snow slippery? Then why?
Well, okay.
Why?
So we'll get onto a little bit more about how viruses work. In a minute.
Okay.
The third hypothesis is the escape hypothesis, which is that viruses are genes from more complex life, be it bacteria or anything else, that just broke out and managed to get inside other. So
that one's pretty messed up, because I was gonna say, I bet it's because bacteria and maybe archaea as well, and I don't know as much about them, but they can exchange genes to create more diversity with other bacteria. They can share genes, which is the genes are made up of the instructions,
genes are made out of
which
denim.
Is the mRNA or the RNA.
The genes are made out of denim.
So it would make perfect sense if those kind of little parcels of genes just ended up getting separated off and picked up and reproduced that way and came from that kind of process, right?
Especially because your DNA isn't in this coherent double helix all of the time. A lot of the time it's broken down into its component parts.
Just a little bowl of spaghetti.
Yeah. That's how viruses can get in, work themselves into it in the first place.
I believe that parcels of genes are called jostles.
Jostles. Kind of freaked out by the idea of viruses just being random bits of cells from random multicellular organisms that just got spat out and left around.
There are probably not multicellular, honestly, because we suspect viruses are older than multicellular life.
Yeah.
But there's so much freaky stuff coming up, so get ready. So let's talk about viruses and you.
Hoo-yah!
Viruses and me.
Yes. The most obvious way that viruses impact the evolution of other life forms is through a kind of immunological arms race, right? Your body needs to be able to protect itself against viruses, and so it tries to evolve as quickly as it can at the same time as the viruses are evolving as quickly as they can to both survive, essentially. As I've mentioned, no real fossil record of viruses, but we do have paleobiology.
Paleobiology?
Paleobiology.
Isn't that the diet where you don't eat carbs?
Okay.
Oh no, that's paleo.
So a retrovirus is a specific kind of virus that, as a necessary part of its life cycle, gets written into the DNA of its host. So that the host cell then reproduces it. If that happens in a part of the body or in a cell that's responsible for making sex cells, for making a sperm or an egg, then these viruses can be inherited, right? And in active forms as well. So the new child that's created can also have an active form of this virus.
So does that mean then that the child will then be recreating the virus?
Yeah, so then
as
it
well
becomes
as just
a
having
heritable
it done.
trait.
Right.
Yeah. So oftentimes that will degrade as you go through the generations, because there's no real benefit to the host for it to survive.
Right. So it
as
could
much
just
as
be the kind of biological experience for that generation, generational kind of reproduction, could just be this kind of addition of a bit of junk that doesn't necessarily do anything or have much effect, and so it doesn't necessarily get like favored or reproduced, and it kind of might naturally kind of change over time as well and sort of mutate.
Yeah.
So does that mean that I inherited more than just my ugly looks from my dad?
Rude.
Also,
be nice to yourself, Jen.
his viral history.
Yeah.
Why would I ever be nice to myself?
Why would I ever do that?
As much as 8% of the human genome is comprised of retroviruses that have been caught by humans and their ancestors only in the last 60 million years.
I'm just taking a bit of time to decide whether I'm okay with that fact.
3% of your genome
8% is a
that
lot.
we know of, 3% of your genome does stuff.
Right.
That's useful and 8% is retroviruses that from the last 60 million year period.
So what's the rest of the 87%?
53%
Junk.
is, we honestly don't really know what it does, but it could well be from other viruses that are so far degraded, by this point. And like a third of them are genes that preserve themselves in a similar way to a virus, but without needing that virion step of the life cycle, by which I mean they are they are like selfishly reproducing themselves to no real benefit to the humans.
Right, so it's like a meme in your code that gets reproduced and iterated, but it doesn't have the effect of producing any characteristics or like any proteins. It doesn't produce a protein or anything. It's just kind of there in the code.
Right, exactly. Some genes, however, derived from viruses, and retroviruses in particular, because they're the ones that have to write themselves into your genome. That's not to say that they're the only ones that have written themselves into the genome, but they're the ones that do that as a part of their life cycle.
In order to continue existing and
yeah.
Yeah.
Some retrovirus genes are surprisingly persistent, by which I mean genes that we know to have come from retroviruses because they match up perfectly, continue preserved in their original form or close to their original form, despite the fact that all of the other genes associated with that retrovirus, other retroviruses, have degraded with time. And then that begs the question, why?
Right, so it basically pretty much... I mean, that obviously suggests that that piece of viral DNA or RNA is actually useful for it to be reproduced so closely for such a long period of time.
There are a myriad of these. Most of them we don't know what they do. But one that we do know. So think about a platypus.
Okay.
What does a platypus do that other mammals don't do?
Honest to God, I have no idea how we went from something I didn't understand to platypuses.
How does a platypus differ from other mammals?
They lay eggs, isn't it?
It poops eggs, yeah.
They lay eggs.
It poops eggs.
And in fact, they are the only mammal not to have a specific retrovirus gene that in a virus helps prevent your immune response to that virus, and in a placenta helps to prevent the mother's body rejecting the baby and its placenta. And also helps cell fusion.
What?
Placental mammals can only exist because at some point, and in fact at many points, but at some point in history, an early mammal had a retrovirus invasion that gave it a gene that made placental, like the carrying of a baby to term, possible. That's actually happened many times because the gene that we have is not the same as the genes that other animals have.
Right.
So there have been upgrades.
Rach, I'm one of those. I'm a placental mammal.
You're a placental mammal.
What the hell?
This is a placental skink, a lizard.
Well, I'm really confused.
Rach, I'm sorry, I think you're mistaken. Those don't exist.
Skinks. Lots of different kinds of skinks. Some skinks lay eggs. Some skinks have live births.
Rach, I just want to stop you there. It's pronounced skunk.
Some skinks, which is a kind of lizard, lay eggs.
Which are not lizards.
Some of them have live births. Some of them do both in the same pregnancy. And one particular kind of skink gives birth to live young with a placenta that is remarkably similar to a human placenta.
So you're saying that skinks
has
are
the
humans?
Same retrovirus genes that mammals have that make placental.
Well, then it's not a bloody lizard, then, is it?
Possible.
It's not a lizard, then, is it? It's just a cold
lizard.
mammal.
It's
Honestly, it takes
I'm sorry, it's a lizard.
It takes 30 minutes of investigation into the arbitrary complexity, ancient, constantly changing, nothing is the same between one thing and the next, complexity of biology, to just how do turfs exist? I'm just oh, there's only 2 sexes. How does that even make any sense? Look at these guys. Are you looking at these guys right now? It's just...
Have you seen this mammal that lays an egg and this lizard that gives birth to live young? Have you seen them?
Why are platypuses considered mammals? Why aren't they ducks?
Because they are more closely related to all other mammals. They produce milk for their young.
I've always been taught if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a platypus.
But does it quack? Yeah, that's the question.
I think it's all immoral. I think it's all against God. We need to legislate it out of existence.
Legislate the skink out of existence. That cannot be right.
Yeah, so that gene.
Don't forget to write to your MPs if you don't want the skink to exist anymore.
Yes, so other gene transfer helps to assist in that immunological arms race by preempting the invasion of new viruses.
So it's one virus wants to beat the other viruses out. So actually, we find it useful because we're you're on my side now. You're on my team.
It's not even that. It's in order to enter a cell, the virus needs to use up a particular chemical resource to get across that membrane. If that gene is in the cell already, then it will be using up that resource already, or as it moves between,
Right, so then that resource isn't available for other viruses to do the same.
Viral
attacks, Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And finally, let's talk a little bit about cyanophages. So you may recognize Cyanobacteria as being this incredible blue-green bacteria that photosynthesizes, produces a huge amount of oxygen for the atmosphere, and is also a fundamental food source, a fundamental step in the food chain for
blue smoothies.
Oceans.
Yes.
Yeah. Cyanophage is a virus that I was going to say predates upon, but is parasitic upon, perhaps, cyanobacteria. But it's not super useful for the cyanobacteria to die before it gets to reproduce the virus in sufficient quantities, right? Especially since this virus is basically floating around on the ocean with no rudder, no way of steering itself at all until it hits into exactly the thing that it needs to hit into. So there are losses, presumably. So what the cyanophage does, what it has done, despite lacking all of the other structures required to photosynthesize, it contains several genes, or different variants of it contain different genes that are instrumental in making photosynthesis more efficient. So when it enters its host's chances of survival and of producing oxygen are significantly improved. So a lot of the oxygen that we breathe are because of viruses that are parasitic upon cyanobacteria.
Okay, that is really cool. So it's increasing its host's capacity so that the host has more capacity to feed it, reproduce it, make more of it. Not feed it because it doesn't need feeding, right? It's just literally just making more units of it.
Exactly.
Right.
And how did it get those genes? It got those genes from its hosts, and it gives them to other hosts. And sometimes when you have two different kinds of cyanophage in the same host, they can exchange genes as well.
Just like little presents, just like, hey, you need a hand? I got one of these. You can have one of these. It's like little trading cards.
I mean, probably not on purpose. They can't do a whole lot on purpose. Yeah. But, yeah.
It's more like, I'm here, so you've got one of these now. I don't know how you feel about that. We'll just do it anyway.
It reminds me of something, and I don't know what. I think maybe. Is it something from? No. I'm going to sound like a complete fool. It looks like, is it something from Steven Universe?
Yeah, it does. I feel like those things are modelled after viruses, honestly. The ships, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Injectors.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I've got. I just think it's...
You just think it's neat.
I think it's so neat.
So I'm going to level with you, Rach.
Cool.
I did not understand a single bloody word you said in the last 20 minutes.
Long story short, we think of evolution as being a family tree that starts at a root and spreads out from there. It's not that. There is gene transfer all over the place, and viruses are right up in there, making that happen, so that despite the fact that two cyanobacteria lineages split off from each other a very long time ago, there is gene transfer between them to make them more efficient.
Right.
That despite the fact that a skink and a human are not super closely related, they are both capable of very similar placental pregnancy. It's wild.
So it's like the most essential kind of unit of carrying and transferring genes from place to place, cell to cell, organism to organism.
I guess. Yeah, I mean, that's what it...
Because it basically
that's
just
what they...
is a piece
and
of
all,
RNA or DNA bound up in proteins to carry it around.
Yeah. And entirely in the pursuit of their own mindless reproduction.
What happened was, when Noah had the ark, a duck loved a beaver very, very much.
And
Hence
created
why-
the ark.
And created the platypus.